In direct violation of a Supreme Court order, Joe Biden enacted an illegal eviction moratorium. Now, I covered the lawsuit against the Biden administration yesterday, but we have some new and interesting developments. It would seem that Joe Biden's eviction moratorium may actually violate, and wait for it, the Third Amendment. Known as the runt piglet of the Constitution, the Third Amendment has never been used by the Supreme Court as the basis for a ruling. But that might change. Joe Biden was told in no uncertain terms that the federal government, the executive branch, does not have the authority to mandate people give their property to someone else, particularly in this way. They were told, Joe Biden was told by the Supreme Court, go to Congress. Congress couldn't pull it off. They didn't have the votes. Some Democrats didn't want to do it. Republicans didn't want to do it. Why? Not every landlord is a billionaire with massive properties. Many are retirees. They have a building. They rent out their basement. Now they can't evict people. So Joe Biden decided, you know what? I'll violate the Supreme Court ruling because what are they going to do about it? It is a terrifying precedent we have seen now in the past year a couple times. Cuomo did it. When the court said you can't restrict the First Amendment, he said, fine, executive order has been quashed. I'll make another one. This is the era of politics we are entering. It's not like we've just now broached the area. Executive orders have always been murky. But this is the idea. The idea is that Joe Biden knows what he did is illegal. He said as much. I don't think it'll pass constitutional muster, but at least it gives me a month to enact it anyway. Now, that's bold. It's one thing to say in good faith, I am going to try and implement something to help the American people, even if it might not be legal. We don't know yet because the Supreme Court may say otherwise. It's another thing to be told explicitly what you're doing is illegal and then be like, yeah, well, I'll do it again. Sue me. So effectively, we are in political lawfare. What happens in the next couple of years? Say a Republican wins the presidency, then they just start rubber stamping as many executive orders saying, oh, we know they're all illegal, but it gives me a month to do whatever I want. And if the courts say no, I'll do it again. Congratulations, Joe Biden. You are effectively dismantling this country. But on to the bigger story. I saw this it's an amicus filing, a briefing, amicus curiae. I'm not a lawyer, so bear with me. Arguing that invariably some of these people who are being housed are soldiers, and thus the government is quartering people in private residences in peacetime, regardless of whether or not it's peacetime. There's no legislation mandating this. This is fascinating because it's true, isn't it? The Third Amendment, for those that aren't familiar, is the amendment that says no soldier shall in peacetime be quartered in a person's home without their permission. And if it's in war, there must be legislation. This is an extremely, extremely important amendment. And I'm going to lay out for you not just the news, but an argument that we must take the Third Amendment as seriously as possible. And we must begin an onslaught of legislation defending this country and citing the Third Amendment. The founding fathers, when they enacted the Third Amendment, we didn't have the modern understanding of the surveillance state of intelligence agencies, of federal law enforcement, and large police departments. So the idea of the soldier, that was the law as we knew it. I dare say the Third Amendment must be reinterpreted to expand that the government shall not place in your home any element or apparatus of the government without your permission. And there are cases that broach this topic. We need to look back at the First Amendment to understand how it's changed and our rights have expanded. Of course, the challenge is always the government doesn't like to give up powers. And while the First Amendment mostly there's a lot of lawsuits about like someone saying something to somebody else and then someone getting offended, this is directly telling the government no. So why would they ever interpret it in any way other than to say it's irrelevant? Well, let's make those arguments. Before we get started, my friends, head over to timcast.com, become a member, and you will get access to exclusive members-only segments from the Timcast IRL podcast, as well as an ad-free experience. You'll also be supporting our fierce and independent journalism, much like the story we have for you today, which breaks down what's going on with the lawsuit, as well as the Third Amendment arguments. My friends, this is truly amazing. The Third Amendment, so rarely ever invoked. And I read the argument, and it's brilliant. They seek to shut down Biden's illegal moratorium by saying you cannot quarter soldiers. Dare I say, I think the government shouldn't be allowed to mandate anyone for any reason go into your property, which is really interesting in how it will play into the Fourth Amendment, which I believe it was supposed to. But let's read the story and see what's going on. Before we do, smash that like button, subscribe to this channel, hit that notification bell, share the show with your friends. And apparently there's something new called a super thank. I don't know exactly what it is, but I guess you can, there's a button below the video player that says thank. You can tip the channel if you want to support our work as well. Feel free to do so if you are so inclined. Let's read from timcast.com. Biden admin sued by realtors and constitutional lawyers over eviction moratorium. Reporting, Charlie Mills and J. Lee Hemman reporting for timcast.com. The Alabama Association of Realtors have filed a lawsuit against the Biden administration over the CDC's eviction moratorium. The moratorium was put in place despite a June Supreme Court ruling that the CDC exceeded its existing statutory authority by issuing a nationwide eviction moratorium. Clear and specific congressional authorization would be necessary for the CDC to extend the moratorium past July 31st. According to the CDC, landlords violating the order may be subject to a fine of no more than $100,000 or a year in jail, or both, if the violation does not result in death, or a fine of more than $250,000 or 1 year in jail, or both, if the violation does result in death. The CDC found authority for passing the order through a creative reading of the Public Health Service Act of 1944, which give the CDC the power to halt disease by providing for such inspection, fumigation, disinfection, sanitation, pest extermination, destruction of animals or articles found to be so infected or contaminated as to be sources of dangerous infection to human beings, and other measures. The CDC uses the other measures standard to bridge the gap between acts like providing for sanitation and effectively seizing homes owned by landlords to allow people to live there rent-free. According to the U.S. Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals, that reading would grant the CDC director near dictatorial power for the duration of the pandemic, with authority to shut down entire industries as freely as she could ban evictions. In an ironic twist, the Alabama Association of Realtors lawsuits states the moratorium, quote, extension relies on the same source of authority that this court, the Sixth Circuit, and a majority of the Supreme Court found inadequate to justify the eviction moratorium. The CDC's semantic recasting of the latest extension is a distinction without a difference because it has no bearing on the CDC's legal authority. The lawsuit added the Supreme Court ruled that only the legislative branch, not the executive, had the authority to extend the moratorium. Congress tried but failed to enact a legislative extension in reliance on those representations. Yet rather than accept that as the final word under our constitutional system, the CDC extended the moratorium anyway. Now here's where things get fun. An additional amicus curiae briefing filed by the Third Amendment Lawyers Association is raising interesting legal arguments about the constitutionality of the CDC's eviction moratorium, claiming the move is a clear violation of the Third Amendment. The Third Amendment has awakened from its slumber. The eviction moratorium may violate the Third Amendment. And that's the Third Amendment Lawyers Association to the rescue, posted a First Amendment lawyer. We can see one user on Twitter, J. Marshall Woolman, says, I am pleased to announce the Third Amendment Lawyers Association has submitted an amicus brief in the CDC eviction moratorium case. This is fascinating. The Third Amendment states, quote, no soldier shall in time of peace be quartered in any house without the consent of the owner, nor in a time of war, but in a manner to be prescribed by law. Quote, the federal government today is not likely to ask people to house soldiers in their homes, even in time of war. Nevertheless, the amendment has some modern implications, writes the National Constitution Center in Philadelphia. It suggests the individual's right of domestic privacy, that people are protected from governmental intrusion into their homes. And it is the only part of the Constitution that deals directly with the relationship between the rights of individuals and the military in both peace and war. Rights that emphasize the importance of civilian control over the armed forces. Some legal scholars have even begun to argue that the amendment might be applied to the government's response to terror attacks and natural disasters, and to issues involving eminent domain and the militarization of the police. I believe that the Third Amendment is not, dare I say, the runt piglet of the Constitution, but perhaps one of the most important amendments. We always say the First Amendment. It's first for a reason, saith Dave Chappelle. And the Second Amendment is there in case the first one doesn't work out. That was one of his bits. But we don't often talk about the third. We jump immediately to the Fourth Amendment, the right to be free from improper search and seizure. Now, all of these rights can be halted or restricted through due process. And that's the Fifth Amendment. You have the right to due process, or actually, I think that may be the Sixth. I mix them up sometimes. But we often gloss over the importance of the Third. Do you want to know why the Third Amendment is probably the Third Amendment? Because back then, the Founding Fathers, to them, the authority of the government was instituted by the soldiers. The redcoats from Britain were the ones enacting the law of the crown. And they said, you cannot be in our homes, and you cannot search us and take our property without due process. But soldiers, times change, but the meaning is still relevant. Now we have police officers, law enforcement, feds, etc. They function very similarly. And there have been court cases that have said, so what? They can do what they want because they ain't soldiers. I bring you now to the Third Amendment Wikipedia page. Amazing. Wikipedia says, the amendment is one of the least controversial of the Constitution and is rarely litigated, with criminal justice writer Radley Balco calling it the runt piglet of the U.S. Constitution. To date, it has never been the primary basis of a Supreme Court decision, though it was the basis of the Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit case Engblom v. Carey in 1982. They mentioned something really interesting in a judicial interpretation. I want to read this for you because we need to seriously consider making some arguments to the Supreme Court or other courts or citing the Third Amendment more often. Judicial interpretation. The Third Amendment is among the least cited sections of the Constitution. In the words of Encyclopedia Britannica, as the history of the country progressed with little conflict on American soil, the amendment has had little occasion to be invoked. To date, no major Supreme Court decision has used the amendment as its primary basis. The Third Amendment has been invoked in a few instances as helping establish an implicit right to privacy in the Constitution. Justice William O. Douglas used the amendment along with others in the Bill of Rights as a partial basis for the majority decision in Griswold v. Connecticut, 1965, which cited the Third Amendment as implying a belief that an individual's home should be free from agents of the state. There it is. I agree. That was the point. One of the few times a federal court was asked to invalidate a law or action on the Third Amendment grounds was Engblom v. Carey. In 1979, prison officials in New York organized a strike. They were evicted from their prison facility residences. They were reassigned to members of the National Guard who had temporarily taken their place as prison guards. The United States Court of Appeals of the Second Circuit ruled the term owner in the Third Amendment includes tenants, paralleling similar cases regarding the Fourth Amendment, governing search and seizure. National Guard troops are soldiers for the purposes of the Third Amendment, and that the Third Amendment is incorporated by virtue of the 14th Amendment to the states. The case was remanded to district court, which dismissed it on the grounds that state officials could not have been aware of this interpretation. Interestingly, they say, the most recent Third Amendment decision handed down by a federal court on February 2nd, 2015. The United States District Court for the District of Nevada held in Mitchell v. City of Henderson that the Third Amendment does not apply to intrusions by municipal police officers, as, despite their appearance and equipment, they are not soldiers. For his claims under the Third Amendment, Mitchell had alleged the police used his house as a lookout point. I believe that's wrong. The police should not be allowed to use your home for any purpose. I mean, honestly, for any purpose, period. I mean, perhaps you can argue with a warrant, with due process. Maybe that's fair and there should be severe scrutiny on that. But I don't see a big difference to the modern police departments and what the soldiers were doing back then. Police didn't exist back then as we know it. Police departments were relatively new. Now we had local militias enforcing the law. This is what a lot of people don't understand. We did not have police departments necessarily back then. And then you get the old trope about the sheriff in the Wild Wild West and his deputies, but no large-scale police department. Cities started expanding, and they required agents of the state to enforce the law, to make arrests, and to keep the peace. I'm not a big fan as to the direction things have gone, and I think we do need reform. Either way, what the Founding Fathers were talking about was absolutely clear. From military.com, this is why the Third Amendment was so crucial for a post-revolution U.S. Writing, they say, ask any American to list the rights enshrined by the U.S. Constitution, and they'll be awfully quick to tell you the first two. Hell, take a drive on any freeway in America, and you'll see a couple bumper stickers supporting the right to free speech and the right to bear arms. Then there's the Third Amendment. Now, we know this. No soldier shall in a time of peace be quartered in any house. It remains the least controversial amendment in the Constitution and is rarely litigated. To date, there has never been a Supreme Court ruling that has used the third for a basis of a decision. Today, the idea of troops seizing and occupying a U.S. citizen's home sounds absurd. Unfortunately, this wasn't the case back when the Constitution was written. In 1765, the British Parliament needed to shelter their troops as they fought in the French and Indian War. So the Crown did what they liked to do and made a decision that benefited British troops. They enacted the Quartering Acts of 1765, which stated that inns, stables, taverns, and wineries were required to house troops at the discretion of a British officer. Troops were allowed to take as they pleased, which would run taverns and wineries dry. The cost of quartering troops would often fall on the shoulders of local business owners. Eventually, their expenses were reimbursed by colonial authorities, not the British government. Soon, British troops started taking refuge in private homes. Without fear of penalty, they could barge into your house, kick you out of your bed, take your food, and tell you that you'd maybe be paid back in a few months. To the colonists, this was a headache, but at least there was a reason for it for a time. After the French and Indian War ended, the British troops continued to use private residences. Many returned to their own fortifications, but many others continued to exploit the Quartering Acts for their own gain. This, coupled with the fact that the colonists were still paying for a foreign standing army for no discernible reason, fostered resentment toward the British by many Americans. Now, at the time, keep in mind, the Americans considered themselves subjects of the crown, although many were starting to push for independence and probably didn't. Then the Boston Tea Party happened. The Brits saw rebellion brewing and enacted the Quartering Acts of 1774. This time around, it clearly gave all British troops the right to occupy any building they saw fit without any obligation to reimburse the owner. Most colonists weren't personally affected by the tea tax and were simply inconvenienced by the stamp tax. Having Brits come into your home without warning or cause and being forced to give them whatever they pleased, however, was a straw that broke many colonists' back. When the dust settled and the American colonists became American citizens, one of the concerns they voiced most was that something like the Quartering Acts never happen again. And it became so when it was enshrined in the Bill of Rights and became the Third Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. What you need to understand about the quartering of soldiers is that they were going into inns and taverns and they were taking people's stuff. They were taking food and drinks. They were consuming without regard to what they owed the individuals who lived in these places. So now let's talk about that eviction moratorium and why I think the Third Amendment does apply. Now, obviously, renters are not soldiers, nor are they agents of the state. But dare I say, the government should not be allowed to mandate anyone occupy your private property, period. Without due process, of course. So far, right now, we have no due process. The Supreme Court so much has even said so, but I think we need to go further than just legislation. You're not going to make a law banning political speech. I think we should make it clear. The government can't mandate they can't mandate people go in your house. I want to show you something that's really, really funny. George Carlin from biography.com, how George Carlin's 7 words changed legal history. Do you know George Carlin's bit? The 7 words you can't say on TV. I think it was called the 7 dirty words. The funny thing is, I still can't tell you them for different reasons. You see, here's the big difference. If I were to do the bit from George Carlin and explain to you the 7 dirty words, the worst thing that would happen is that YouTube demonetizes this video, meaning no ads will appear on it. I can understand that. What advertiser wants to appear next to a bunch of slurs? Even though it is George Carlin, one of the most profound and brilliant bits of comedy ever done. However, for George Carlin, when he did this routine, he actually got arrested. The authorities said what he had done was indecent. Amazing. The FCC had received complaints. It was indecent to say these words. We talk of free speech today. We talk about the right to free speech on the internet. But you need to understand that our modern understanding of free speech is new. It wasn't always the case. If you went outside and you said something naughty, they'd arrest you. We had a U.S. Office of Censorship during World War II. Now, I understand wartime efforts. But dare I say, it is time to take the Third Amendment seriously. The government, it should be interpreted as such to say that the government cannot intrude on your private residences. And that is a very, very important amendment right now. Even if you're a renter, that's even more important right now, as many people seem to be losing their properties. But if you rent a place, then you are considered to be, for all intents and purposes of the Third Amendment, the owner of that residency. Not the building, not the property, but what we consider to be the internal residency. Times change. Perhaps we'll need to amend and reinterpret things often, but we got to look at the Third Amendment and say, if you live somewhere, the government can't force people to be in your home. I think that's very important. And I'll tell you why. Right now, the Justice Department is defending the new moratorium in court, even though we know it is plain as day illegal. CBS reports. The Justice Department defended Biden's new eviction moratorium in a court filing Friday, citing the CDC's finding that the deteriorating public health situation necessitated a new invocation of its authority and responsibility to protect public health. I've said it before, I'll say it again. When you read those old stories, Fahrenheit 451 or 1984, Brave New World, etc., whatever dystopian novel you may have read, or perhaps a movie, Hunger Games or Divergent or The Maze Runner, did you think that the dictators, the authoritarians, wouldn't have an excuse? I think this is one of the biggest things people miss when they see these stories. The assumption that in V for Vendetta, the chancellor rises to power just by snapping his fingers and one day saying, I'm now the dictator. No, in V for Vendetta, there was a public health crisis. Obviously, don't overlook it. So when authorities come to you and say, here's the crisis, bend the knee, you've got to think. Will they ever give up their powers? And the answer is probably no. We're on day 508 of slowing the spread. 508. 508 days to slow the spread. That's the challenge. The exploitation of our goodwill. Because we want things to improve. We want to work together. But now people don't trust the system, which is putting the system itself at risk. If you do not respect people, they will stop respecting you. And if you break their backs, eventually they will say enough and they will walk away. The people who are losing their homes right now in this illegal action are not millionaires and billionaires. I love this. From the New York Mag, conservatives are freaking out about the eviction moratorium. Conservatives are? Yeah, I guess if it's mostly older people. Millennials don't seem to own property, I suppose. New York Mag says, in pushing the CDC to renew a limited version of the expired eviction moratorium, Joe Biden was making the best of a bad situation. Let me just tell you, he's breaking the law and ripping this country to shreds. But let's read. For one thing, the Supreme Court Justice Kavanaugh, writing a concurrence in a 5-4 ruling, allowing the moratorium to stand for another month, warned the administration that his patience might run out. There's a strong possibility a lower court backed by SCOTUS will swap the measure down, just as there is a less robust possibility the courts will recognize a 60-day version of it. Biden's decision to not press for an extension was a judgment call. And when the president got serious heat from congressional Democrats for bungling the situation, he did the righteous thing by giving the benefit of the doubt to those facing evictions. I don't want anybody to be homeless. That's worrying to me. I just went on a rant about how the Third Amendment must protect renters as well as homeowners as well. But it's not going to protect the renter from the homeowner saying, get out of my property. If somebody lives in a house and a government agent, or let's say Joe Biden says, if you rent an apartment, we're going to take a homeless person and put him in your apartment. I'd be like, no, you can't do that. The Third Amendment should apply. The government cannot mandate a person for any reason be in your home without permission of the owner or due process. That means if you want to serve a warrant, if you want to search the property, you get a warrant. This is entirely something else. Now, I'll admit we have to work out the legalities of it because I'm not a constitutional scholar, and perhaps this is just the raving rant of an ignoramus who doesn't understand how the Third Amendment is or is supposed to work. But as far as I can tell, the government should not be allowed to mandate people live in your home. That's one way we can put it, right? Living in your home. That's very specific, and that's what they're doing. From Fox News. Landlord out $24,000 in rent due to eviction moratorium, says tenants buying boats. Not the first time I've heard a story like this. Now let's think back to that piece from military.com about the Third Amendment, why it was enacted. Because soldiers were coming into people's property, extracting from their hard work and taking from the working class and leaving them with nothing. They could only hope to be paid back. So we have this story. A landlord who lost $24,000. He's still got to pay taxes, insurance, even some utilities, and only hope that maybe he'll be paid back. No way, I don't accept that. Buddy Shoup tells Fox and Friends he's still bound by law to maintain properties while the funds dry up. From the Wall Street Journal, eviction moratorium's renewal squeezes small landlords. Most landlords. The Wall Street Journal reports the CDC enacted the eviction ban last September to prevent people with financial hardship from being evicted during the pandemic. Since then, many smaller landlords have struggled to collect their monthly rent checks, and some have gone into forbearance on their mortgages. The government took a firm stance that there would be an end to the ban, said Bam Pinagar, president and chief executive of the National Apartment Association, a landlord trade group. Now there's no faith. The new moratorium, if it is not successfully challenged by opponents, would mean that landlords will have gone more than a year under the federal ban without their ability to evict tenants. Gene Sperling, White House advisor to Biden, said Thursday that the extension was necessary, so this we understand. The eviction ban has also been a challenge for many of the small business owners who rent out residential properties. Many invested their savings in apartments because the business has long been considered a relatively safe investment, one that would produce reliable income into their retirement years. And that's what we're talking about. Individual landlords or mom and pop businesses own about 4 out of 10 rental units in the U.S. Landlord groups say that small owners who have fewer financial resources than institutional investors are suffering the most, are suffering from unpaid rent. More than $46 billion in federal government aid is available to landlords whose tenants haven't paid them. As of the end of June, $3 billion had reached them, according to the Treasury Department. The money has been slow to reach landlords, though that has recently improved, Treasury officials said. Many landlords say they have no wish to keep renting to tenants who have repeatedly shown that they cannot pay. That sentiment has sometimes been a barrier in administering pandemic rental aid. Program rules often require landlords who accept rent aid, even in partial sums, to forego evictions for a set period. Many property owners don't want to keep tenants with a history of not paying. Retired couple, Rebecca and John Faulkner, own a rental home in Western New York, where they say they are owed more than $13,000 in unpaid rent, dating back to March of 2020. Their tenant has refused their pleas to pay and installed a private property no trespassing sign in the front window of the house, Ms. Faulkner said. Even once the eviction ban is over, the Faulkners don't expect to recover the money they lost. We can sue him, take him to court, but you're not going to get blood out of a turnip, Ms. Faulkner said. Some property owners say the federal moratorium gives more power to delinquent tenants than local protections do. Brittany and Eugene Kozlenko rented out their Connecticut home for 2 years while Mr. Kozlenko took an engineering job on the West Coast. They plan to return home in July of 2020. Their tenant stopped paying rent in April of that year and refused to leave at the end of the lease, they said. The Kozlenkos say the tenant now owes them approximately $50,000 in back rent. Imagine that. You can't even go back to your own house. These people don't understand when they advocate for this stuff. No, we don't want people to be homeless, but this is not a simple black and white solution or issue. Let's say I own a small house and I have to go on an extended work trip. It's a tour, a 3-month tour. Maybe you're a musician. You're not a famous Hollywood musician, but maybe you're a tour drummer. And they say, we're going to be on tour for 3 months. It's a long time to be away from home. So you say, you know what? I'll rent out my house just for the 3 months. And then when I come back, everything will be great. And the eviction moratorium hits. I assure you there are people like this that have been affected by this. I mean, in this story, they went to the West Coast just for a temporary job and they wanted to come back and they can't. The person won't leave. That means these are not even necessarily small business landlords. These are just people who have a house and they're like, I'm coming home. I want to go home. Sorry. Can't do that. If you rented out your property just before the eviction moratorium, you could have ended up with somebody living there indefinitely. And now what? I don't think the government has this right. Now, the amicus curiae briefing specifically says that the ruling should pertain at the very least to soldiers. I can respect that, but I don't think it goes far enough. In their conclusion with their briefing, they say, the COVID-19 pandemic has caused hardships for millions of Americans. What it should not cause is the deprivation of constitutional liberties, chief among them the freedom from quartering without consent during peacetime. Thus, the court should allow the plaintiff's motion vacating the moratorium at least to the extent it applies to the evictions of soldiers. In their argument, they actually say, we think the whole thing should be thrown out, but at the very least, you can say, soldiers, you got to go. Funny, the last person I want to evict from an apartment is a soldier. I like our veterans. I like our active duty soldiers. However, the government clearly cannot do this. Sorry, guys. Men and women in uniform, tremendous respect. But the government can't mandate you can stay in someone's home. Now, that's specific. And that means they mentioned this. The government didn't even mention the fact that many of the people, the millions who are living rent-free and won't be evicted, are soldiers. Well, government's gotta say you gotta be able to remove them. To evict them, you can't quarter these people in the property in the violation of the property owner's agreements. So there will be some civil law which protects people from eviction, but this is different. These are soldiers, and that could include National Guard too. I think we need to take the Third Amendment seriously and start recognizing what it really means. It means that you should be free from intrusion in your home by the government. It is broad. I think it should mean that they can't come in your house, take whatever they want, do whatever they want. That means civil asset forfeiture out the window. I think the Third Amendment should be seen as something much, much bigger than it is. We need to think back to why they implemented it, why it was so important to be number 3. And it shouldn't be the runt piglet. It should be the third most important. I'll leave it there. Next segment's coming up tonight at 8 p.m. over at youtube.com/TimCastIRL. Thanks for hanging out, and we'll see you all then.